Hi there, I'm Diane Callahan, developmental editor and YouTuber quotidian writer. I'm here again with Marie McCue, who is the co-writer. Yay! She's the co-writer of Unbound Life with Riley Rookhouse, who's also known as Jordan Riley Swan on the rom-com and urban fantasy side. Riley Rookhouse is his high fantasy pen name. And we also have, by Marie McCue, we have these two novellas, The Mina of Misfortunes and Viet of Vows, which are set in the same world. They're part of the Cast-Offs series. And today I want to talk about writing a novel with multiple perspectives, multiple points of view. So when a story is told from more than one character's perspective, so like in A Song of Ice and Fire and Wheel of Time and things like that, it's very common across genres, whether young adult or literary fiction, but I think there's a really special love for it in high fantasy. So without further ado, I wanted to say that with Unbound Life, it has 3 points of view, right? And yeah.
Correct, yeah.
Yes, and I know that you're working on another fantasy project right now that has like way more POVs than that, but we can start with Unbound Life. So
Sure.
give us like the rundown of the 3 perspectives real quick. So what are they?
Sure. So we've got there's 2 acolytes who are teenagers. They live at this monastery up on a mountain, and they're training physically, spiritually, mentally to eventually ascend and become these celestial dragons. And so that's like this religion that they follow. That's sort of the end goal. And then the third POV is Seth, who is sort of a mysterious traveler. There's a lot that is not clear about his backstory in the beginning, but he has an agenda that conflicts with theirs, I'll say. And it's as the story evolves, their paths intersect in really surprising ways.
Yes, and that's so cool. And the other thing is that each of them, this is sort of the introduction to the world and the characters, because each of them gets their own book. Like Mina of Misfortunes, Mina is one of the POV characters in Unbound Life. And then we also have Dark Dawn of Dawns that came out recently. He's another POV character. And then like Seth of Storms, I think that's going to be coming out next year potentially. And so he also gets his own novella. So you get to sort of have this standalone story of like, okay, here's all the 3 of them together. And then like you have the continuation of their story, because there's a lot that's like unresolved, right? So it's like, you get to go and continue to follow them on their journey in their own like separate installments. So I think that's really fun, because it's sort of like the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe of stories. It's very much like very much an interconnected story.
For sure.
Yeah. So like, how did you approach writing those 3 different characters?
I would say, I guess the biggest thing was to like the biggest thing that I found that I had to do was to not write multiple POV chapters back to back. So like I'd have to give myself space after writing one to write the other. And it's this, like, the situation behind the book is a bit complicated, because it started out as 3 individual novellas, but as we went through and stitched them together, there was a lot of like reworking it to give them stronger personalities and just to distinguish them from each other more. And so during that process, it was like, wow, I need to like take a step back from each character as I'm doing their chapter, because like it's so easy for their voices to get blurred together, and for their like just their perspectives to kind of get muddied. And so I found that was helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting though, because I almost feel like that might be a clever approach for some writers, is to write like all the chapters from one character's perspective, like back to back, even though there might be time jumps or they might be on other characters' chapters. But I know that some writers use that as an approach so that they have that sort of cohesion, or they edit all of them, like just all the chapters from that POV and then just all the chapters from the other ones. Like, so And then of course you want to edit them like all in sequential order as well. But I think that it does create kind of that extra layer of like necessary revision where you're like, okay, they have to all flow together, but then they also need across their own perspective to be cohesive. But so, I mean, in a way, like I wonder if it was actually very helpful to have like to write all the separate novellas and then put them together just for
that's a good point. Yeah, I think it probably took some of the load off actually in the end.
Yeah, because I think it is very difficult, like when you're writing a story and switching back between characters. I mean, I guess you know, because that's the other project that you're working on, Dragon Sphere. You pretty much had to write, like, I don't know how many characters is it?
Like around half a dozen.
Half a dozen, yeah, six different POVs in one book, and then those are all like you're writing them one chapter at a time, and then yeah, so that's
exactly.
Yes, so that's a very different. So that's like the totally opposite experience. So how does that compare, like writing individual chapters with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's sort of the same thing, like probably dialed up even more because it's there's no two POVs that are the same character back to back, and so you really just have to, like, I guess, kind of give yourself space to reset the voice in your mind before you write the next one.
Yeah, do you have any sort of like anchor that you use to get you into that headspace, like a piece of dialogue or writing or reading the previous thing that you wrote about them? Or
yeah, that's usually my go-to. I sort of go back to the first chapter that I did in their voice, which is usually the strongest, like I found in the first draft, and so I'm able to sort of draw from that.
Yeah, because I think it is like it's hard not to get like farther away from it, especially as you're writing like 5 other POVs and then you have that one. Yeah, that makes sense. But yes, what other sorts of challenges have you faced in differentiating the perspectives?
I think it is like, I guess the biggest challenge is that it is third person POV, and so you're not hearing the prose isn't their internal monologue, but you I still try to inject their voice into their perception of the world and their observations, and so that has been an interesting challenge because it's like giving description and like explaining events. I try not to just have it be neutral. I try to give some of their perspective to that description, and so that's tricky because like the default for me was always to just like explain the events and not think about their voice too much. But I think it does help distinguish them and set their different chapters apart.
Yeah, and I think that there's always sort of that 2 layers to the story, right? It's like there's what happens, and then there's like how the character perceives it or feels about it, and so there's like those 2 layers. Like here's the objective plot, like what they see happen, but then like their reaction to it and the way they describe it, like the words that they use, and the things they notice. Like so those are 2 separate layers, and it's sort of hard to think of them both at the same time. Because I have that happen too, where I'll write something and I'm like, oh, this doesn't really feel like it's coming from the character. It's just like anybody could have said this, right? Like it's just because you're telling yourself the story still, and just trying to be like, okay, this needs to happen now. It's happened, but then now I've got to like spice it up.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I know that Jordan mentioned that he had for Dragon Sphere, which is the one with the 6 POVs, that one he has a way to differentiate them all. Like he's adding like sort of a narrative device to each one. And I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. I think so. There's I think what he was talking about the flashbacks, right? And how they each have different so they're marooned on an island, and that's where the main storyline is taking place, but to give more backstory on each character and to just give them more depth as opposed to just knowing them as survivors of a shipwreck. I think that the flashbacks, that'll be an interesting challenge, just because it's like, so far I've really only written them as sailors who are marooned, and so it'll be fun too to give them more depth, and I'll be excited to see how that informs their POVs going forward.
Yes, because yeah, and I think that he found like a different way of introducing each flashback. Like it's not just a flashback. Like one is that she talks to her husband as like a way of like like sort of mentally speaks to him, and then like another one is that he thinks about like certain incidents, violent incidents in his past, and he's a very kind character in the present, so this is like the flashbacks are very contradictory to that. And so like having those sort of different mechanisms of the flashback, I think is helps make them come more alive, because it's very creative. I think that the way that he's approached it, because I know he was afraid of making it like Lost, which I love Lost, because that's also like like a multiple POV show basically, and does the flashback structure, present day interspersed, and then Six of Crows, that very much like that has like a sort of flashback structure too, also very big cast, because I think that is hard when you have multiple POV and you're trying to be like, okay, I want to keep the reader in the present story, but I also want them to care about the character's past. So I think that is like being very elegant with flashbacks is difficult. But sure. Yeah, like so what degree of like backstory do you like to include when it comes to like multiple POV? Like with Unbound Life, I'm not sure if there's like too much backstory in this one yet. I think that comes more in the novellas, but
yeah, I think really the amount of backstory, I guess, for me just depends on like how I want their, like when I'm plotting a book, I kind of think about how I want the character's journey to evolve first, and then I figure out like how to make a backstory that will complement that in some way. And so
yes,
yeah, I would say that it just kind of is like whatever is needed to give their journey more depth and have it make sense.
yeah, and that's difficult with like multiple POV. It's like you also don't want to overwhelm the story with like every single character's backstory, because that's quite a bit. But so I think that's something that with Seth's storyline in Unbound Life, like he has a very mysterious past, and I think that's what makes readers most curious to read more about him. Like I've heard several readers be like, I want to know his story and his book with the novella. So I know that Jordan's like, I'm gonna hold off, and since people want that one the most, that's the one I'm gonna like wait to release as a yeah. So I think that there is something about like almost like teasing the backstory and leaving it sort of a mystery for later books. Like you don't need to do it all in the one book. I think that's especially true with multiple POV, where you don't want to overwhelm the reader with information.
Right, absolutely.
Yes. And then so do you have any writing strategies that you've used to help you write multiple POV novels?
I think I mean usually before I started with Story Garden, I was very much like someone who wrote without an outline and without really knowing where the story was going. But when there's so many characters involved and there's so many people whose voices and whose development you need to know inside and out, that I think is less feasible. And so yeah, having an outline has been really, really helpful for that. And I think if I ever like write more or plot more multi-POV books, that's going to be invaluable.
Yes, no, it's very true. And like I don't like to be too pro outline, because there are definite downsides to outlines, but I think in this case, especially even having like a broad view of it, because you don't want to get to an end of a character perspective and realize it was pointless or that their story wasn't interesting. Like, oh no, like I don't need this character perspective. And then that's very difficult to take that whole POV out sometimes, because because they become so stitched together. You change one thing, you change like all the other POVs theoretically, because I mean if you could take out a POV and it doesn't change the story, then that might tell you something too. But with that in mind though, like how do you sense that a character should be a POV character rather than just a secondary character?
I think it would just come down to like well, I suppose for me it would just be like, is this somebody whose voice I would enjoy writing in? And like, are they will they be fun to write from their perspective? And I think that would that would probably be like the deciding factor for me, the biggest one.
For sure. And I think like as a writer, like if you have fun writing it and you enjoy it, I think that comes through to the reader. So if you're sort of just writing them because you feel like you have to, then that's probably like not a good indicator, like trusting
Right.
your gut on that feeling. But who was your favorite of the three from Unbound Life? Like there's Seth, Mina, Darkon.
I would say Mina, just because I would say that what happens to her gets most into the horror,
Yeah.
side of the fantasy horror. And so, and I love horror. So, that was just such a blast.
It was, yeah, and I agree with that too. Because with Mina, like she's similar to one of a character from like a project that I'm working on. Like they have like a similar sort of power. I feel like they would relate. So I think there's also like me reading it from almost like a writing craft perspective, and like, oh, here's how my character is more in contemporary world, and this is more high fantasy. So it's like really cool to see it play out, and just yeah, I also like the sort of horror angle, and I will say that it's like a death related angle, and that's something I'm very interested in when it comes to fiction. So yeah, that's really cool. And then what about like in Dragon's Fear? I think that there's like a female like almost not like a villain. What do I call her? Is she an anti-heroine or like
I would say how would I describe
is she an
her?
antagonist? Like
I
I'm
would,
not
yeah, she's
very flawed.
very extremely flawed. I guess she's an antagonist in the sense that she really only creates problems for the other characters, and um, yeah, she's immoral. She's got a ton of baggage, but she's just been such a fun character to write, just because I get to make her detestable, which is a lot of
Yes.
fun for a POV character.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that like she's been described as like a white trash Cruella de Vil or something like that. I think that's what,
That
yeah.
was what they said.
Yeah, for yeah, Jordan and Amy, our our team there. Yeah. So I think that that's something too when it comes to multiple POV. I mean, Game of Thrones does this well too. You want to have these characters like, oh, here's this person that's more sympathetic and likable, and here's like
Right.
sort of the villain or antagonist or the anti-hero, like the person you have complex feelings about. Like when you have people along the moral spectrum, that makes it much more interesting. And oftentimes, sometimes I think that like the villain perspective is almost the most fun to read. Like the person that is like, you're like, oh, I hate them, but I want to read more from their
Exactly.
perspective. So yeah, I think that's another thing with like POV. It's nice to have all those, because if you just have like five people that are all very heroic, then it's like, that's like maybe they'll get a little samey over time.
Right. Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah. So, and then how do you tackle like the timeline of events when you're writing multiple character stories?
Wow. That's a good question. Because I guess like with Unbound Life, the timeline's very linear, and so and I suppose it also is with Dragonsphere, but I think yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see like what challenges arise as these flashbacks get worked in, because then it's like you have to account for how they've developed as characters since the flashback happened, and
Yeah.
try to work that in, and then you've got the multiple voice thing, and so it's
Mhm.
I think it'll be a fun challenge.
Yes, for sure. But I think, yeah, I think it does help when you have a linear timeline where you're not like going back, like between chapters, you're not like, oh, now I'm back before the previous chapter and then like catching up. And instead, yeah, because I think you're right, like Unbound Life is very linear, and it's like that makes it easier to follow. But I know that some multiple POV novels, or even writers' projects that I know they're working on, that might be not doing that, and they might be going like a little more back. And so I think like having like very clear time markers is useful in that sense. Like you at the beginning of every chapter, somewhere there, how much time has passed or where they are in the story. And yeah, so
Absolutely.
that's really good. And then let me see. So were there any books that you've read that you look toward for guidance on multiple POV, like whether that's like writing craft books or other novels?
um I think I would say Song of Ice and Fire just is the best one that I've read so far, that not just in juggling all the different storylines, but also in distinguishing the characters from one another, because there's so many, and somehow he's able to make them all memorable. And so that was like what I was trying for anyway.
Yeah, I think it really is the guiding star of the multiple POV genre, like especially in fantasy.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, with Song of Ice and Fire. So because it is really, it's like almost difficult to think of like another one that's that much of like a keystone for the genre. And then in other genres, there's multiple POV books. Like I see it in there's a book called Female of the Species by Minnie McGinnis. That's a young adult novel, and that one has multiple first person perspectives, and it's really well done. It's like a dark young adult thriller. So that's one that I would look toward for myself, because personally I don't really write multiple POV. Like my brain does not think in that. Like I think one of my first projects was like an alternating, like a dual POV first person, but most of my stories are singular. Like Wish Hunter is another Story Garden project. That one's just third person, one character, the whole book, the whole series even, because I think that helps to simplify it. But I know that Jordan tends to prefer much bigger casts, much more like even Limelight and Larceny, which is like one of our kind of comedy crime novels. That one has many POVs as well, and yet it still fits together. And I think it's a big challenge. But I think like if it's something that you feel an inclination for, then you can go into it. Because you said for yourself that you did or you didn't really write multiple POV before Story Garden.
Yeah, it's not really.
Yeah.
I dabbled in it, but I was never able to really like get it to work. And I think part of it was the outline versus no outline thing. And so
I get it.
Yeah.
For sure. Yes. And then with Dragon Sphere, that how many books are going to be in that series?
That's going to be a trilogy.
Yeah, it's going to be a trilogy. So yeah, so writing multiple POVs across the series, that's going to be like another sort of like, because they are like the same POVs, like sort of mostly, unless some of them die.
A few of them get changed out between books, and so
yes.
that's interesting too, because it's like in book one, maybe there's a character that shows up who you don't get to write for, and then in the next book they're a POV character, and so
yes, that's right. Yeah,
it's fun sort of revisiting them from a different perspective.
Yes, that's so true. And I think that I have seen that done. I'm trying to think of any specific series, but yeah, there have been ones where like they're more secondary, and then you get to sort of read their first hand account more closely and understand them better. Yeah, so I think that's something that's really fun with multiple POV, is that it really opens up the door to do that. Like, because if you have like one book where it's one POV, it's like kind of weird to go into the second one where you have like a bunch of different ones. Like you sort of want that consistency. But
exactly.
Yeah, but that's really exciting. I'm so glad. So thanks for thanks for joining me again here to talk about writing and everything.
My pleasure. It's great.
Yes, and I love the use of multiple perspectives in Unbound Life, so which our viewers can buy on Amazon in print or ebook, including the illustrated edition, which I have right here. And we also have Mina of Misfortunes, as we said, was like one of the POV characters in Unbound Life. So I put all those links in the description, and so we'll see you next time in our story garden.
Sweet.
Yes.